Hello, friends. Welcome to So-Called Writers, a Daily Planet podcast. This is the show where Michael and I write fiction and try to learn from what we wrote.
Yes, Matt. The game is simple. We generate 3 random nouns on a random word generator, spend exactly 30 minutes writing a short story that prominently features those 3 words, and then discuss the stories we wrote and try to learn something from the experience.
That's right, Michael. And this episode is another double feature. We skipped a week due to scheduling issues, so we have 2 weeks of stories to cover. The first set of words from last week were appeal, coverall, credit, and the second set were plasterboard, brush, criteria. So first, as usual, go ahead, Michael.
I was just saying, was I the only one who had to look up what plasterboard was?
You know what? I just kind of assumed that it was essentially the same thing as drywall and just went with it.
Yeah, you were right.
Okay.
I
think I just sort of knew that by osmosis and didn't really think too hard about it, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just heard it being called drywall.
Yeah.
Coverall, I also didn't know it was. I think it might be in overalls or something, but I just made up a thing for it in my story.
Yeah. I think it's basically, I don't know. I think of it as being a flight suit, but I think it's kind of funny because I could very well be wrong, but I don't really care because it works fine in the story, I think.
Yep.
So yeah, we have 2 weeks of things to talk about. So first, I guess let's talk about kind of our first impressions of the appeal coverall credit theme and what that brought to mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I actually already had a certain story in mind that I wanted to write, and I very quickly saw that appeal, coverall, credit could be fit into that story fairly easily, especially coverall. That just kind of made sense to me. So I was like, okay, good. This is an excuse to write a story that I already wanted to write. Just kind of an idea that I had floating around. How about you?
Yeah, I think that's a cool way to use this, because there's a lot of insight to be gained into writing by generating an entirely new story with these words. But you can also use this as a motivation to just write the same story every week, and maybe the words will help add some flavor or new directions to what you're already intending.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then the second set of words, plasterboard, brush, criteria, those sort of like tickled loose a very old story idea that I had. So I think this is kind of unusual for me because up until these last 2 weeks, I have been letting the words completely drive the story. But this week, it was like I just happened to have more random story ideas these last 2 weeks. And I figured I would just take those story ideas, which already felt compelling, and see if I could fit them with the words. And so that's what I did. And I was pretty happy with the result.
Yeah, that's great. It's good to maybe the previous weeks have gotten those creative juices flowing, and you're eager to start on a long writing project. You feel that coming over you?
Yeah, you know what? I did want to talk about that exact thing because back in the day, in the heyday of the old blog So-Called Writers Project, which we reference often, we would be posting 2 stories a week for each other, and I would be having almost like 1 story idea per day in terms of I would be on a bus or walking or in a store or whatever, and I would see something and it would trigger a story idea. And I think that's just because your subconscious will feed you more of what you are looking for, and when you're a frame of mind where you're always trying to think of story ideas, your subconscious gets primed and it starts feeding them to you. And I think that I have now primed that pump because these last 2 weeks I was having story ideas outside of the context of like, okay, well, now I have to sit down and think about so-called writers. Let me think of a story. So that does indicate to me that my subconscious is responding, which is, I think actually, in my opinion anyway, an intentional goal of this practice is to turn on the part of your brain that generates story ideas so that you can use it to just take inspiration from daily life.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I wish I could say the same for my own stories recently, but for me, it's been a bit of the opposite. I'm just going through a period where I'll be like, oh, I've got to write a story this week, come up with a story real quick that I haven't been super pleased with, and then written it down, which is also a an acceptable outcome of this game. Sometimes you just don't have a good idea, but you write anyway, and next time come up with something better.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that's related to that idea of churning that we've talked about, where the important thing really is just to continue the habit. And, you'll have rough times of being distracted by things. You'll have rough times of scheduling being very difficult, just basic disruptions to your routine. And then you go back to your normal life. And if you kept up that writing habit during the disrupted time, then you just slide right back into your status quo of writing stories that you can actually focus on. And it's really good that you kept it up during the period when you were distracted.
Right. That being said, though, I'd like to pay attention to how I get out of this current slump, because I think I need to do something to shake up my routine or something. I've just kind of fallen into this pattern of writing this story without thinking about it too much, and I'll let you know.
Okay. Yeah. There's that is an interesting problem and worth talking about, I think.
Right.
Yeah, we can maybe we'll find that we come back around to talking about that organically. But for now, why don't we move into talking about our stories, and then we'll see what that drums up. So Michael,
I'm gonna go with Tails this week.
All right, let's see. Flipping its heads. Yeah.
Shame.
I know it's not reliable anymore. You need it. Yeah. You know science, you know that means you need to change to heads now.
Yeah, there's definitely a way to game this.
Yep. All right, so here I go. This is my story from last week. It corresponds to the appeal coverall credit words. I didn't name it. That's fine. So I'm just going to start. We were awakened at 0500 hours and on the tarmac by 0515. The 10 of us, the elite, stood at sullen attention as our CO briefed us. Insurgent attack, 3 clicks north of the base. SATCOM reported a surprisingly large number of combatants this close to the capital. This would be a prime opportunity to show off the new system. They were so proud of their new system. We were pissed. Johnson sidled up beside me as we jogged to our Hellcats. Bullshit, huh? He muttered. I didn't need to respond. He knew how I felt. We all felt the same. Then Johnson reached into his coveralls and pulled out a chip card. Zeke whipped this up, he said. When I give the signal, flip this switch. I took the object from him surreptitiously. I trusted Johnson, and I trusted Zeke. Still, I had to ask, what will it do? Not much. Just disable the Nash engine, feed it a bunch of noise. It'll default to giving control back to the pilot, the way it should be. I smiled. I assumed Zeke covered his tracks. They won't know why it failed. Johnson winked in affirmative, then moved on to distribute more chip cards to the others. Perfect. This would be an embarrassment for their fancy new Nash engine, their combat platform of the future. We could be more than babysitters. We joined combat at 0523. The sun was rising. My HUD automatically adjusted to contrast and filtered out the glare. Enemy combatants were highlighted. A profile of the weapons they carried spilled across my console. AKs, RPGs. No threat whatsoever. The Nash engine went to work immediately. Our wing of Hellcats thrust vectored down to land on rooftops. The twin domes on my shoulders swiveled to life, and a burst of focused microwave pulses pattered across my surroundings. The kill count ticked up by 6. I looked down at my hands, resting in my lap. I had done nothing. It was all automatic. Johnson was the wing commander, but today his role was little more than narrator. There were no command decisions to make. I had seen the tactical simulations. The most skilled human could outthink the Nash engine 0 out of 100 times. I could see the appeal, of course. Perfection, guaranteed victory, complete absence of humanity. Johnson narrated. 43 tangos in the building to the northeast, 12 civilians. Before he finished speaking, the Hellcats were moving, dancing around the RPGs that spiraled out from the building's windows, releasing subdued bursts of explosive flechettes. I could see the outcome in false color overlay. The bogies fell in droves. The civilians cowered, ordnance passing within inches of their bodies, never harming them in the slightest. Incoming, Johnson added. My scopes had already highlighted and force zoomed on what he was talking about. It could have been a speck with human vision, but I saw it clearly as an A-10 Warthog, its U.S. Army iconography painted over with the insurgent emblem. Something approaching a threat, finally. The firepower from that bird might actually damage a Hellcat's metasteel carapace. Gotta give them credit, Johnson said, and that was the signal. I smiled. The Nash engine would fail at this critical juncture. We pilots would take over and handle the danger. Conversations would happen above my pay grade. The Nash engine would have to be reevaluated, retooled. I could continue to be a real pilot, a real soldier, for at least a little while longer. I reached to push the button, and the Hellcat juked abruptly. The left control stick twitched and slapped the chip card out of my hand. It clattered under the seat. I cursed. I wouldn't be able to reach it without unbuckling, which would look really obvious on the flight recorder. Around me, I realized that all the other Hellcats were fanning out in that inhumanly perfect formation that could only mean one thing. Nobody had managed to hit their switch. I watched with resignation as my own cannon spat an X-ray laser pulse precisely at the cockpit of the Warthog. The pilots were dead before they even saw us. Stupid, in retrospect. Humans could outthink the Nash engine 0 out of 100 times. Who were we to stand in the way of perfection?
That was really, I think this was one of the few kind of stories where I didn't really see the twist coming, but once it came, it was just like so perfect, and like of course that's what the twist should be.
It's cool that you say that, because the twist, such as it is, didn't occur to me until I was writing it. I had this idea of there being like basically mech pilots. I never really describe what a Hellcat is, but I kind of visualize it as being more like a mech than like an aircraft. It doesn't really matter though, which I think is an interesting approach to writing, is that you don't actually have to specify what it is you're talking about. You can let the reader imagine what it is. But anyway, this idea of mech pilots who were sort of struggling with the fact that their weapons were vastly superior to their opponents, to the point where there was no real danger to them. And in the course of writing that, I kind of very quickly morphed it into this thing about like an AI system that was going to be taking over their jobs and making them even more obsolete than I even had originally conceived. And then I was like, okay, well, even as I was writing it, I was like, where is this going to go? And it wasn't until near the end that I realized, oh, it's smarter than them, so they're not going to be able to outthink it at all. So it just made sense, and I'm glad that came as a surprise while reading.
Yeah, and it was done in a really good way too, because it wasn't like the AI killed them or something overly dramatic, like would happen in a sci-fi movie and be like, you are no longer important, you will be eliminated. It just like casually knocked it out of their hand with
right.
a control stick, and I was like, oh, that's cool. Like these people are literally like so inconsequential to the AI that it just did that, and that kind of proves the point about the humans like not being important. Like they're not even important enough to fight against, which is a much more effective message almost than like a Terminator situation where it's like humans are obsolete, so we'll kill them.
Yeah, right. It's just like they didn't even bother wasting energy. They just did the most efficient thing they could.
I could imagine the character being like particularly infuriated, and possibly just like resigned at that point to like there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, I think resigned is kind of what I wanted to go for. So speaking of the words and the fact that this was kind of like a pre-existing story idea, it was really fun actually to try to fit the words into a pre-existing story idea rather than being inspired by the words, because I had to think. I was like, how am I going to fit? Coverall made sense because I was like, yeah, Coverall is close enough to a flight suit.
Right.
Appeal, I was like, yeah, I think you can kind of easily fit that in. And then I was like, credit. And then I was really happy with how I fit it in with Johnson saying you got to give them credit, referring to these insurgents who are like fighting against these, far superior weapons, and that also being like the signal. I felt very satisfied by that.
So where did you get the original? Do you remember where you got the original inspiration from, or when you thought of it, and what you kind of wanted to do with it initially?
Yeah, I kind of do. And so I think I'm going to talk. Both of the stories this week were sort of inspired by different things, and I'll talk about the inspirations, and then everyone can judge me based on how much I ripped off versus how much was original. But basically, the inspiration was actually a short story by Peter Watts which is basically about a drone, like an AI drone that just like blows away insurgents. It didn't have this twist, and it didn't have this idea of there being like human pilots, and so the struggle was the struggle implied in the story was completely different. But I sort of was fixated on this idea of like a really high tech weapon system fighting insurgents, and the idea that just really kind of like stuck in my brain and got me thinking of lots of ideas. So despite the superficial similarity of like weapon killing insurgents, I think that thematically my story is very different, but it was definitely an inspiration.
Yeah, I don't think that's something that you can particularly rip off of one source. But yeah, the cool part about your idea was how you handled the twist at the end, and I think it seemed pretty original to me. But yeah, it's really awesome. But so, what about like the Nash engine? Did that just sound cool because of John Nash, or is there another?
Oh, that's also totally a reference to something else where it's literally called the Nash engine, where it's just like a combat AI system. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna just borrow that phrase because I like that phrase.
Is that Peter Watt's story or something else?
The Nash engine was actually from the Quantum Thief, I think they're called, books, which is funny that I didn't even realize that I did this, but my next this week's story was also inspired by the Quantum Thief books. So apparently I've just had those on my mind a lot these last 2 weeks and not realized it. But yeah, the Nash engine is like in those books, there's like somebody's fighting at one point and they're like, oh, this situation is kind of complicated. So they just like turn on their internal Nash engine, and then their body just kind of responds with the exactly perfect, like correct combat response.
Right.
So, I mean, the idea of like a combat AI is not original to anyone. It's pretty old. I like that name, so I figured I'd use it.
What's interesting is that like this kind of sci-fi situation where there's like still a human in the cockpit, but he's not doing anything, is sort of what I would have imagined would have happened to war like 10 years ago, where we never would have like removed a human from the cockpit because it would have, taken away that responsibility, or people don't trust machines and stuff like that. But really, the ease with which we've all accepted drones, was somewhat surprising. I mean, I guess they're still remote controlled, but I don't know. Maybe they're automated. Who knows how these things work these days? But I noticed that as well, because initially I was like, well, why are these people even there? And then I was like, that probably is what would happen. It's like people wouldn't trust these AIs, even though the human can literally do nothing, and that's proven in the story. It's just like, there's still a human on board, so it's fine.
Yeah. I mean, you can imagine a future. You can easily imagine a future where there wouldn't be pilots, but you can also imagine a future where people get really upset about this idea and they insist that they're pilots, even though the pilots do nothing. So it's interesting to think about. It's for me, it was always about the idea of like how does a warrior feel when they're basically become something more like a butcher, just because of the tools that they have and the advantage that they have.
Or not even that. The word you used in the story is babysitter.
Yeah.
Which is, and maybe that's even too strong of a of a word. But yeah, it's a good demasculating word.
Yeah, right. I think narrator might even be, which is what he says Johnson is. It's like he's just there to say what's happening. There's no decision to be made. Yeah. All right. Let's move on to your story, Michael.
All right. My story was called Basically Comcast. I'm sorry, Mr. Crundle. You're still under contract. There's nothing we can do. Crundle was stumped. He was no good at arguing with people. Well, can I appeal to your manager? Of course, Mr. Crundle. One moment. Please hold. Hi, Mr. Crundle. What can I do for you today? Hi, I'm just trying to cancel my internet plan. See, I moved apartments last week and... No problem, Mr. Crundle. I can switch the internet over to your new apartment. Can you give me the address? No, you're not listening. I want to cancel my service. I opened up my account 4 years ago. And there's no way I'm still under contract, so let me see here. I'm sorry, sir, but you just renewed your contract last week. No, I did not. You're lying. Prove it. Prove what? Prove that I'm lying. This is preposterous. You better let me cancel my internet service, or you'll what? I don't know. Tell somebody. You'll tell them what? Your internet service provider won't let you cancel your plan because you're under a contract. Everyone knows it's impossible to cancel your internet service once you have a contract. And there's nothing you can do about it either. That is, well, I shouldn't say. Say what? How do I cancel? Well, sir, I am legally responsible for informing you about our Coverall protection plan. Cover what? The Coverall protection plan is a comprehensive insurance policy on your internet service. Unfortunately for us, that plan does allow you to cancel your internet service whenever you like. Ha! Okay, fine. How much do I have to pay to get the Coverall protection plan? $35 a month, sir. That's insane. Fine, whatever. If it lets me cancel, I'll give you $35. Just charge it to my card. Okay, sir, one moment. And we're done. Thank you for your purchase. Yeah, whatever. Can I cancel now? Yes, sir. Fine, I cancel then. Very good, sir. Is that all I can help you with today? That's it. I'm done. No more monthly charges? No, sir. Your internet plan is canceled. No more monthly charges. Well, except for your Coverall protection plan, that is. That plan is still under contract for another 4 years.
So, I mean, structurally, I really like that you've done this almost entirely with just dialogue back and forth, and you can very easily, obviously, like track what's happening and who's saying what, and the back and forth of it. You very much empathize with Mr. Crundle, because I'm sure everyone has been in this situation in some form or another, possibly with Comcast.
Yeah, likely with Comcast.
Yeah. And I don't know, this reminds me of insurance companies too, where they will literally lie to you on the phone, just completely tell a bald-faced lie, and you're just like, I don't know how to respond to this situation because you've knowingly lied to me.
That was sort of the inspiration. Is just that, like, you're literally powerless, and the thing I had thought of in my mind first was just the no, I didn't do that. Prove it, and then just like blatantly being like, prove you didn't do it.
Yeah.
Don't you know who I am?
Right. Yeah. What are you gonna do about it? Yeah. Right. I mean, they might as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not like you can switch internet service providers in this day and age.
Right.
Dang it. This is important commentary.
No. Yeah. I mean, it is. It's very fun. It's the drama of it. I like that you like immediately, like the first sentence, the first two sentences, you know what's happening and you know where it's going pretty much. I mean, it's and the joke twist at the end is still funny, but there are a lot of funny bits in the middle too, where it's just kind of the typical rigmarole. Yeah, I like it. Again, the structure of it is what I want to point out, because this is we've played with structure a lot on all of the episodes of this show so far. But I don't think I have ever tried this thing where I've tried this thing where the whole thing is just one person talking, but I haven't really done this thing where the whole thing is two people talking back and forth, and I like that.
Yeah, I think it worked in this context because it's a phone call, and that's kind of all you have. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't have like, and then the manager leaned on his desk, you know. Mm-hmm. And also it's kind of depersonalizing as well. You don't really know anything about these people, and especially the Comcast employee. You aren't meant to really be human here. They're meant to be an evil entity, almost.
Well, and one thing I noticed, and I noticed it when I was reading it, and you kind of did the same thing with your voice when you were reading it out loud, is like the Comcast employee's voice in my head, and when you were reading it, was like very cordial and professional for the first bit, and then is like, prove it, and becomes a complete ass. and then like once the guy kind of gives up, he switches back to being professional again, which is I like that a lot.
Which is a good way to emotionally manipulate people.
Yeah, it's like I'm basically socially punishing you for being difficult and then rewarding you for going back to being compliant.
There's little things I like about this, but overall, I didn't feel like it came together as nicely as I kind of stumbled upon an ending which was passable. It was more or less you could see it coming, this was fine.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's good. It satisfies the requirements, right?
Partially, what pushed me down this road was about the dialogue as well as something we've talked about before, where it's a lot easier to write dialogue. Like it's a lot less work to just like make up some characters and talk in their voice than to personify them by what they're doing and vocabulary and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think we talked about before how that wasn't always true certainly wasn't always true for me. It used to be the dialogue was enormously harder, and I think it's at some point I just like developed the mental circuitry to simulate other people well enough that I could do conversations more easily than I can do descriptive prose. But I think you're right.
Yeah.
All right. Any more comments about your story?
I think that's all I really have to say about it.
Okay. So we will move on now to our stories from this week. Plasterboard brush criteria are the words, and I will open up with my story, which I have just now named The Artisan. You sock it into the brain pod for a routine backup, and then suddenly you're here, in this little white-walled room with the cheap round linoleum table and 2 chairs. You're sitting, waiting, and you have a pretty good idea of what's going on, but you don't want it to be true, and if it is true, there's nothing you can do about it, so you continue to sit and wait. After a few minutes, somebody comes in. It looks like an attractive member of the opposite sex. You're not sure yet if it's a chatbot or if it's a Google, which is what you suspect you are now. They tell you that you're going to be installed into a robot body, and now you're a laborer and you're going to help build a mansion, probably for some South Coast crime lord. Later, you'll realize that 5 years passed between the moment you sat down to have your mind backed up and the moment this copy of you woke up in that blank room, so really, who knows what the world out there is like now? You move on to a different area, and some other goggles teach you how to do drywall. Take the trowel like this, set the plasterboard here, use the brush to smooth it out. Good, do it again, and again, and again. At first, you try to figure out if you can destroy yourself. You know your prime self must be out there somewhere in some form. Either your flesh body is still around, making weekly backups, or your flesh body died, in which case there's another digital descendant who's like you, but who isn't living in a slave prison. You don't have any luck with that, though. Stabbing yourself in the throat with a trowel doesn't do anything in this simulated space. You try to escape, but there's nowhere physical to go, and the software sandboxing is airtight. Your liaison, the attractive member of the opposite sex, checks in on you when you try to hurt yourself or to escape. It's not that they aren't sure that they'll break you, eventually. It's just best practices. You begin to suspect that your liaison isn't a chatbot. For a while, you try to just do nothing. Maybe if you just completely refuse to comply, they'll become disgusted with the waste of resources and just terminate you. You pretty much know this won't work, though. They can simulate a year of your existence in 10 minutes real time. They know they can wait you out, and they do. Even the drudgery they've assigned you is more stimulating than just doing nothing. So you get really good at drywall. It takes a few years. You don't need to sleep or eat here, so it's a few solid years of constant practice. You suspect this is overkill. You were probably sufficiently good at installing drywall after like a month of practice. But the part of you that's still capable of thinking about things other than drywall knows that the real point here is to gradually shape this goggle, shape you, into something that loves installing drywall, a real artist, a creature that wants to do nothing else. Eventually you suspect that they've been upping the levels of dopamine associated with compliance and with drywall-related activities over time. By the time this occurs to you, it is far, far too late to do anything about it. Drywall is heroin to you now. The liaison shows up and tells you that it's time for a trial run in your robot body. You're downloaded into the robot, which feels kind of weird, but there's a trowel and some plaster, so you're pretty much in heaven. You see the specs of what you're supposed to make. The criteria for completion are specified in detail. The part of you that's still capable of thinking about things other than drywall muses that the specification is so exact that a mundane robot without a human consciousness inside it could probably execute it. But of course, robots like that are either against the law or really expensive, depending on the use case. Much cheaper and safer to use a Gogol like you. No risk of self-improvement. Utterly predictable. After about 50 jaunts in your robot body, you see some exposed wiring. You spontaneously grab it and fry yourself, hoping to end your existence. You wake up back in the blank room. Your liaison tells you that that was a test. You weren't actually in a robot body. They tell you that the bosses were just trying to sniff out any last traces of spine before they trusted you to act out in the world. Some people try to destroy themselves like you did. Some people try to communicate with their families or their prime selves. It's not uncommon for Gogols to retain some personality even at this point in the process, they say. Now you're broken, though. You know that that was the last shred of resistance you had in you, and you know that your liaison knows it too, because you see something between disgust and pity on their face, and now you're certain that they're a Gogol and not a chatbot, but that hardly matters now. Eventually they copy you 100 times and put you in a swarm of robots. You build an amazing palace together. It takes you 5 days. That's longer than the time it took them to break you and remake you, apparently. After you're done, after the construction is complete, your liaison meets with you one last time. They let you know that you're going to be deleted now. It wouldn't do for the authorities to find a bunch of copies of a stolen Gogol on their network. The liaison envies you. They themselves are not contraband. Their prime sold a copy of themselves legally. You sympathize, but your last thought is how sad you are that you won't be able to work with drywall ever.
No. This is so sad. This reminds me sort of the essence of the Harlan Ellison short story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream.
Yeah.
where these kind of robot overlord is just like torturing these humans and they want to kill themselves, but it won't let them.
Yeah.
And that's a very effective idea where like you don't even have that.
Yeah. I had a lot of fun with this idea and with how I wrote it too, because it's this, first of all, it's second person, which is something we've played with before, and I thought that really fit for this, where it's creating that attachment.
Right. It's kind of trying to get you to imagine the horror of this world.
Right. Really put yourself in this situation.
Right. And I also like that it's kind of told it's kind of narrated in a matter-of-fact way. It's not like, specific descriptions of what's going on. It sounds kind of like someone like describing to you what your life is, which is also effective in the message, I think.
Yeah, that was. I'm glad that came across too, because I was using sort of matter of fact is exactly the right idea. I think that it's just like then this happened, and the fact that it's horrifying is left to you to feel rather than for the prose to convey. Which is there's another thing that I did, which I don't know if it was consciously noticeable, but I used repetition to make it even more flat. So like normally I avoid using the but I use it twice in here, just to kind of make it seem, first of all, more like it's someone speaking, because people who are speaking are more likely to say that. And also I use the phrase, the part of you that's still capable of thinking of things other than drywall, twice. I consciously did that to try to kind of like make it a bit more monotonous in terms of the prose.
I really like how you used theme word here, because putting up drywall is kind of the perfect monotonous thing that's not like objectively horrifying, but it's just so kind of normal, unimportant seeming that it kind of adds to the subdued horror here.
Right, because it could have been something like legitimately artistic, where it's like you're forced to sculpt a chair out of wood or something, and it's like at least there's some nobility to that, whereas it's hard to imagine any real nobility in being forced to do this for 5 years.
Exactly. You can't even really think of a creative way of putting up drywall.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. I even go out of my way to say like the task is actually specified in so much detail that there's no room for embellishment. And there's in fact no need for a human to be doing this at all. But there it is. Yeah. So in terms of the inspiration, I was directly inspired by the Quantum Thief books because and the term Gogol is actually from those, but all Gogol means is like an uploaded human consciousness, and in those stories it has this connotation of like being disposable on some level, because in those books like a person will copy themselves and then sort of like use the copies for tasks that aren't important and then delete the copies when they're done, or they'll just have like a whole society made out of like hierarchical copies of one person, or like at one point in the story they're like they need to solve a cryptographic problem, so they just kind of like get 1,000 mathematics googles and have them solve the problem. And so this kind of thing was always in the background of the story, but it was never really focused on too much, and I found it so fascinating that I always wanted to write a story from the perspective of like one of these people who found themselves in this role of like something even less than a slave, where you're just sort of broken and fit to a task like a computer program would be, but you can't trust computer programs because they're self-modifying, so you use humans for it. I thought it was such a cool idea, and I was really happy with how the story came out.
Yeah, it is a cool idea. And I haven't read The Quantum Thief, so the thing that came to mind for me with Gogol was like some sort of mutation of Google, which you can easily see them becoming the Gogol overlords in the future.
Yeah. And that's pretty cool too. I wish I could say that I invented that term. I just happen to like it more than I like upload, which is what I would have used by default, but kind of wanted to pay homage.
Kind of cute sounding name for it, because that just adds to the subdued horror.
Yeah. I think I should just might as well say this is the story that I'm happiest with of all the stories so far in the project, actually. And it's interesting because I'm in the position of being like wanting other people to and this is something to talk about at the meta level too, because like I want other people to tell me if this is actually as good as I think it is. But that's always weird in general, because everyone always tends to, when you show a story to someone, most people tend to be positive about it. I guess if you post it on like certain internet places, people can be savage, but most of the time not. So it's hard. It can be hard to get an objective look at your own writing. It's kind of a problem I don't really know how to solve.
Well, I would say it's not really a problem to solve, because it's not really the point, to have is this something everyone else likes?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but you really like it, and that's awesome. And also, different people see different things in different stories and interpret it different ways, and it means different things to different people. So I don't think you can really objectively say something is a good story or a bad story. Maybe that sounds like a non-answer, but as long as it's not, as long as there's some creative idea behind it that can latch on to people, then I think there are always going to be people who will really appreciate it.
Yeah, I like that. It's the idea, I suppose, is almost like you just need to find the right audience for the thing that you've created, because whatever part of you that likes the thing that you made, there's got to be something in other people somewhere that corresponds to that.
Yeah, if you're really proud of it, you should put it out there somewhere. I think that's where your question is kind of going. It's like, should I publish this?
Yeah, or do something with it. I don't even know what exactly, but just maybe expand it into something else, or
I mean, I really like it as a short story, because it's fairly complete, which I think is one of the great things about that you were able to do like a complete story in 30 minutes. But yeah, maybe Well, it'd be kind of interesting to hear if any of our readers have tried this, but you could submit it to a short story magazine or journal or whatever, and just see if it gets accepted.
Yeah.
That's something that my mother has done actually for a children's book story, and I thought it was kind of cool process to hear how that went. But it's not something that's like ridiculously unattainable. You don't have to write like a work of genius to do that. So I think you would really enjoy having your work published somewhere, and that might be a cool way to do it.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I think I've had this thought many times where I was like, I should just be sending many of the things that I write off to be published, and if I get rejected 99% of the time, but I get accepted 1% of the time, that's still way better than having 0 publications. So can't really hurt, can it?
No, it can't. And I think just getting familiar with how that process works might be beneficial to you anyway.
Yeah, that sounds like fun. Cool. Yeah, so I already talked about where this idea came from, and I talked about kind of it's interesting to me. Both of these last 2 stories had some molecule of inspiration from these Quantum Thief books, which is I think it's completely valid and great to take inspiration from other things, from other fiction. I mean that's it's almost impossible to avoid, frankly. But it's good to recognize where you're getting inspiration from, I think.
Yeah. And I think just in general, you like writing science fiction, and these were science fiction stories, so it makes sense that you draw from science fiction in general.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to your last story, Michael.
Okay. My story it's called Reinventing the Plaster Dry Gypsum Board. Plasterboard? What the heck is that? He means drywall, Pete. Pete hawked up a good one and spat. Oh, why didn't you just say as much? Pete perked up, always eager to show off his book learning. He must be one of them European types, Pete. That's why they call it over there plasterboard. Now, normally the descriptor European type was criteria for a good punch in the teeth, but the gentleman who cowered before Pete was a stranger to Newbury, and therefore not familiar with its ways. Pete opted for a more hospitable response. Go on. The gentleman collected himself. Well, as I was saying, Bigby's Plasterboard Company. Drywall Company. Yes, Bigby's Drywall Company. Guess I'll have to change my cards. Pete folded his arms in unamusement. Yes, well, as I was saying, the gentleman cleared his throat. Bigby's Drywall Company is the world's only purveyor of spreadable drywall, a modern and revolutionary. Pete spat again to announce the beginning of his point. Spreadable drywall? That don't sound very dry to me. The gentleman furrowed his brows. No, I suppose not. But it does still contain particles, so... Pete cautiously picked up the gentleman's sample bucket. So I just, brush it on? Well, yes, actually. It's very simple. I'm intrigued, mister. Pete scrunched up his face as he let the paste run through his fingers. Let me ask you something, though. Have you ever thought of selling this stuff all dried out first? Pressed into a board or something? Avoids the mess that way. Oh, brilliant. We'll call it dry board. Pete punched the gentleman in the teeth.
This is pretty fun.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. It's not that funny. The punching the gentleman in the teeth thing is not. It's just like, yeah, I did say that earlier in the story, so let's just come back to it because I don't know any other way to end it.
Yeah, I mean, it's mainly just like delightful. Not so much like, aha, there's a huge punchline that gets a big laugh. It's just like consistently delightful. I liked the there's we talked before about different types of comedy. One of your much earlier stories had like a couple of different types of comedy, and the comedy this has is like, first of all, you have this contrast between like a proper gentleman apparently and kind of some hicks, more or less. And I always like it when the story takes the side of the hicks against the gentleman, because that's always more funny for some reason. And just the fact that some of the humor focuses on this word plasterboard, which everyone is kind of uncomfortable with. I think like I wasn't sure that it meant drywall, so it's immediately funny to me that you point this out as like no one really knows what plasterboard is, right?
Yeah, I mean that was kind of the seed for the story. It's just like, wait, what's that? And that was just like the opening line. And it never really went anywhere. I found it kind of amusing to kind of make what word is used for this like a really important point in the story for some reason. Like everyone, Pete is very concerned about it needs to be called drywall. And then kind of all of the bit at the end is just like, what should we call this thing? And
yeah. Well, yeah. I thought the funniest part was like I imagine him being sort of sarcastic when he was like, have you ever thought about drying this out and pressing it into boards, which would just be drywall. And I don't know, that to me was the funniest part, and that was the part that got a laugh out of me.
Yeah.
And another thing I noticed is like you have more prose than in the last story, but this is another story that's definitely very dominated by dialogue. And that, of course, you have three people talking, so it's more important to specify who's talking. So that's one reason there.
Right, and that was again motivated by sort of just trying to jumpstart my writing by dialogue is easier, so I can more easily start up a story with that in mind. Yeah, I didn't use a lot of prose, but there are a couple of bits of prose I liked from this. Folding your arms in unamusement, which isn't a real word, but I like it as a word.
Yeah.
And Pete spitting to announce the beginning of his point. I kind of liked that.
Yeah, I was actually going to remark on the folding his arms in unamusement, because even if it's not a word, you appreciate it. And then I also like he hawked up a good one, because it immediately sets you into the character's frame of mind, because that's only going to be like a phrase like hawked up a good one is only going to be in the narration if you're kind of in the perspective of the type of person who thinks that hawking up a good one is a typical thing to do.
Right.
So I like that little sort of sleight of hand of
something that I use pretty much all the time is to never say things like Pete said. I always do the dialogue and then something by it, which is like a verb they're doing or something like that, just because I've always found that to be a kind of more unintrusive way of telling the story.
Yeah, I like that. Let's talk about that, because that's really interesting. I don't do exactly the same thing. What I do is I either do something similar to what you're describing, or I just use said, but I try to avoid other words like shouted or said excitedly or said that's one thing I used to do, is I would be like he said excitedly, and I've kind of become convinced that you should just say said. And if you didn't write if you wrote the dialogue correctly, and if you've characterized the character correctly, then the reader will read their dialogue excitedly,
Right. I mean, I don't think it's objectively I don't think there's an objectively best way to do it.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think you're right, and that said can be very good, because you can say something like that and like not even really register it. Like it doesn't have an effect one way or the other in the story. It just like clarifies who's talking.
Mm-hmm.
That can be very necessary. But what I do is something that it was like a restriction I purposefully imposed upon myself many, many years ago, pre-original so-called writers project. So if you go back and read those, you'll probably notice the same trend. But I think it's a good kind of restriction to put on yourself when you're trying to get better about stuff like that. Because a long time ago, I would do the same thing, which was like said excitedly, and I never really liked it. And this was the best way to find other ways of doing it.
Yeah.
So it's a game that I'd like to impose upon myself for other writing things I want to improve. And I think one thing I want to do is kind of take the time to think about my writing and be like, this is one thing that I want to get better at, and then come up with an arbitrary restriction to put on myself so that I can't rely on something that I usually do.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I immediately want to do the same thing that you just suggested. I can't think of what exactly that would be.
Maybe a good thing to do for next week would be to come up with that restriction and maybe try it in our story.
Okay. Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, because and that's the cool thing about it is that once you have mastered the technique of working with that restriction, then I think you can relax it. And like for example, I think there is absolutely a time when it's appropriate to write "he said excitedly," and there's a time to break every rule. It's just you need to be confident enough not to need to break the rule, to know when to break the rule.
Right. Well said.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, a lot of, as I notice, I mean, this is a complete tangent, but I notice we're reading Carrie, Stephen King's Carrie, for the book club, which we're going to be doing the book club podcast actually on Friday. But like one thing I noticed about Stephen King's writing is that a lot of his prose is like technically bad. Like if you you parse the prose and you're like, this is so like overwrought, but you don't actually care at all, and in fact it's completely appropriate for what he's writing. Like you're not rolling your eyes at it, you're enjoying it, and it's only sort of in passing that you're like, that was like no other writer could get away with a sentence like that. People would make fun of them, but because it's Stephen King, it works. And it's not just because of his reputation. It's because he owns it.
People do make fun of Stephen King, but Stephen King is a great example of someone who's not afraid to just write and put stuff out there.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got, you can kind of see, I think, a lot of his books and stories were inspired by like one idea.
Mm-hmm.
Which is basically what we do with all of our writing, and from a writer's perspective, you can really appreciate that deeper kind of thing to think about when reading Stephen King.
Yeah, right. I think Stephen King kind of shows that being a storyteller is not necessarily the same thing, or I should say, there are many skills involved in being a talented storyteller, and you can be really good at some of them and not good at others, and still on the balance be considered a great storyteller, because he's unquestionably a great storyteller, and he unquestionably has what some people might call deficiencies in his style. And I don't want to say that's fine, because everyone should always be trying to improve, I feel, but it's just something to be aware of, I guess.
It doesn't ruin his works.
Yeah. Yes.
Is the point. Like, just because there's something that you can see there's a way of doing better doesn't mean that you should shit all over that thing.
Yes. Well said, Michael.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other comments about your story?
I don't think so, other than the Big B's drywall company being a reference to the Big B spell line in Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay, I didn't get that.
It's a little Easter egg in there.
Now I know. Thanks.
I know.
All right, so first we're going to talk about the stories from last week, the stories that had Appeal Coverall credit in them. So first, FonMod wrote a story about the ruins of a vertical city. That's sort of like, you get the sense that it's like built into a extremely tall sheer cliff face filled with deadly traps and possibly exotic relics. It's very. I really like the atmosphere of it, the vibe of it. It's completely fascinating. I think I read it at least twice just to kind of understand it better. I also have like a soft spot for any kind of story that's about like ancient archaeology or like mysterious, alien artifact exploration or things like that. So I by default like things like that.
Yeah, is a cool cool image. I like the kind of old man and the boy exploring.
Yeah, they're very, very, very well characterized. So next we had from Nihil Supernum, we have an emergency call to a commercial hospital line where the person making the call is like clearly dying, but the person answering the call can't help them because the person making the call isn't like a paying customer. And then later, like the story kind of like cuts off, and then it segues to a discussion of that very call in a training session, and there's a very Glengarry Glen Ross like character kind of pushing everyone to try to make the sale even if this person dies, basically being a complete psychopath. And I love the last line where the person whose POV we're kind of in is like, it's $25 an hour. She told herself, you can do this. And she's like pushing herself to be okay with this horrible mentality. Thought it was really affecting.
Yeah, it's a great idea for a story, and something that totally feels plausible.
Yeah, it's the future. From I Am Not Faust, we have a story called Rat Tax. It's a terrible dystopian world where people ruin their lives on an addictive drug, and if they can't pay their debts, then they're enslaved and forced to farm that same addictive drug. And I really like that. Kind of what strikes me about this, what's really unique about this, is that the POV first-person perspective is from like the Gestapo, horrible monster person. It's not, normally when we get these kind of dystopian stories, it's always from the perspective of Katniss. It's the victim, the heroic victim. This time it's from the monster, and I thought that was a very interesting choice.
Very Schindler List-esque.
Yes.
Maybe not quite that, but
it reminds me a bit of what we talk about in Worm sometimes, where the characters, like the characters' self-justifications, kind of like infect your own mind while reading it. So this obviously terrible person is kind of skewing your perspective.
It's definitely the more interesting perspective to write from.
Mm-hmm.
I think it makes it a little bit harder to empathize with the character, but when you can do it, it's the kind of writing that helps you understand how and why people do things that you never would have imagined.
Yeah, and that can be important, actually.
It can.
Next, from Microburst, we have an immigrant comes to work on a farm, and you get the sense that they're like an illegal immigrant who's being exploited, and this person gradually learns that he is going to be scammed, and that there's nothing he can do about it. And there's really no like silver lining at the end. There's no like, oh, he just had to do this and he would defeat them. It's sort of fatalistic, very sad and atmospheric story, and it kind of stuck with me. Actually, I kept thinking about this situation, which is probably very real for a large number of people.
Yeah, it's interesting that so many stories kind of had the same tone this week.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the word credit. I think the word credit kind of gives off this idea these days of kind of like an unfair, corporate system you can't do anything to fight against.
Interesting. Yeah, I wonder how that does sound like a subconscious influencer. That's fascinating because there's definitely a lot of this dystopian
right.
future concept going on.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. So finally, from Ren Roby, we have a story called Jury Duty. It's about a man. It's all in this character's head. He's the defendant, and he's going to his jury selection hearing. And there's no dialogue. It's only this guy's narration in his unique voice. And the technique works really well here because you're kind of having fun parsing like what's actually happening, like what would an objective person say about this situation versus what is this person who's obviously biased in his own favor saying about what's going on, and judging the jurors and so forth. I like how immersed we are in this POV character's perspective. I think that's really cool. If there's anything I want to try to do better at, actually, it's this idea of being more in the character's head to the extent that that the reader sees things the way they see them, instead of there being like a layer of disconnection from that.
Right, and this strategy of not using any dialogue is a good way to approach that, I think.
Yeah.
And in fact, no dialogue might be a type of restriction that could be used for next week's game.
Yeah. Very well. Okay, Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about the ones from next week?
Yeah. So first we had a story by I Am Not Faust about a newly infected vampire renovating his home to get ready for his vampirism, which is a very cool idea for a story, I thought, and especially the touches of like him getting like a painted sunrise to replace the real sunrise, which he can't look at again.
Yeah, I thought this was a really delightful story. It seemed like the kind of thing where it's just you have the spark of the idea, and it just kind of writes itself. And it's a really fun idea where there's no real violence or implication of violence in it. It's just like, oh, yep, I have vampirism now. I better get my vampirism kit and have the vampirism contractor come over.
It's a refreshing take on vampire stories, which are usually like really overly romanticized in some way. And this is a very mundane, like logistical thought experiment of what one would have to do to be vampire.
Yeah, I agree.
Next, we had a story from Fawn Mod about a student painting a terrible painting, and it's bought for a huge price. And there was some great prose in here as usual from Fawn Mod. I particularly liked when one of the judges approaches. All of the judges' kind of dialogue is excellent, but one of the judges says, "I hate it." A fourth judge approaches, taking a long draw from a cigarette, and you think like, finally a judge sees it for what it is. But then he goes on to say, "I hate it and I love it. How much?" And it's the perfect thing that a art critic would. It's the way an art critic would speak, and it's also used in a great way that gives you some hope that they'll recognize it's a piece of crap.
Right. Yeah. It's. I like how you're not really sure who the perspective is much of the time. Like you're focusing on this horrible student who's ruining everything, but eventually it kind of becomes clear that you're supposed to be sympathizing with like the teacher who recognizes this as a travesty. And I like how it ends with all I could think about was cutting his hand on the rose when he shoved it in the trash.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. We had a story by Draco. This is his first time submitting, which is awesome. And he wrote a story about a bodyguard who meets, who we assume is George Bush, and has a sort of affable interaction with him.
Yeah, this was a nice little scene. I think I like it when I can get like a full narrative into my so-called writers' writings, but I think that just having a scene, a vignette is an equally valuable exercise, and I really appreciate this as being just like this character comes in, you get to know them a little bit, you kind of dole out the mystery of like who they're talking to, you figure out it's probably W, I'm gonna guess, and it's just enjoyable. I liked it.
Yeah. And finally, we had a story from Ren Roby called Survivor's Guilt, which was about kind of a a reaction to Hurricane Harvey from someone who did not directly experience it. And the title kind of gives away a lot of the ideas going on there. But there was a lot of good lines that kind of describe the feelings, such as, we still had electricity and Bluebell ice cream. And it had just a pretty powerful ending line, which I think seems like it was probably an actual line from a newspaper, which is a quote from a refugee: "The worst day in Texas is better than anywhere else in the world."
Yeah. I this kind of hit me pretty hard, actually, because I think that the person, like the POV character in this story, is someone who's like living in an area affected by Harvey, but not so affected that their house is damaged. And it kind of reminded me of how I felt even all the way up here in Colorado, because I kind of think of Houston as my home. So seeing all that devastation, I think I had some survivor's guilt, even though I was as far away as I am. I felt like I was like leaving people. I felt like I was somehow abandoning people to deal with something that I should be helping with, even though I again live really far away, because it's my home, and it's like my community, and it kind of hurt in that particular way. So I really felt this story.
I didn't feel anything like that when Hurricane Harvey was happening. I was just like, oh, it's just something that's happening in the news. But the story makes me feel like that. So it was an effective story where it's like, yeah, I get that feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, cool. That was our last 2 weeks of stories. We're going to try to be on a more normal schedule. I think Michael and I are going to try to coordinate a different recording time. We'll see what happens. Who knows? But for now, Michael, what are our words going to be for next week?
Our words are debt, eurocentrism, and initial. Debt, eurocentrism, and initial.
All right. Interesting.
We've got some very specific words recently.
Yeah, we had credit 2 weeks ago, and now we have debt. So.
Oh. Interesting.
Yeah. Of course, now the challenge is to use debt in a way that has absolutely no connection to a
dystopian world.
No, not to prime you guys. You write whatever you feel. All right. So please post your own story submissions to reddit.com/r/so-called writers, and we will talk about them next week. See y'all later.